Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the games we just hadn't got a chance to get to throughout the week. Some really, really fun games in that bunch, especially out in the Big 12. Feels like a huge week over there, but let's get into all the questions I have going into this upcoming weekend. I got a lot of them because there's so many different ways that this week could go. There's so many different variables going into it that it's really hard to get a beat on all of this. But let's jump in here and we'll start with who has the most to prove this upcoming weekend. I think those two teams on your screen are probably the top two, if we're being totally honest. Obviously, a ranked matchup going on in College Station. Both these teams have every ability to become a college football playoff hopeful. A&M walks out of this game with one loss, with a huge win over Missouri. They obviously have Alabama. They have Texas at the end of the year. You split those games, you have every ability to get in, and you have a really tough schedule. Maybe you need Notre Dame to kind of kick it up a notch a little bit, but say you lose both those games. Maybe you're the first 9-3 team that they think about. And then on the Missouri side, your schedule is not very hard coming forward. You do have to go to Tuscaloosa, which is going to be a battle I don't necessarily expect you to win, but at the end of the day, you can drop that one and maybe one other, and you can still get into the field. I think Missouri is one of those teams that this was probably going to be the game from pretty much the start of the year, and here we are. They got to be able to execute on Saturday. And then you got Georgia. Obviously, Georgia coming off that really tough loss from a week ago. Frankly, they haven't been in this position in a very long time. Since 2020, when South Carolina beat them at home, they have not lost a regular season game. We'll see what this team's about. We'll see what Kirby Smart's team is really about in 2024. I tend to believe that they're going to be fine, and I think a lot of people share that sentiment, but it's going to be one of those matchups that, at the very least, will give us an idea of how mentally tough Georgia is after that really tough loss. Then you obviously have Ole Miss, another team that did take a loss, but it was a little bit more embarrassing than what Georgia took, to be totally honest. It's one of those things that this was a team that came in with all the hope in the world. So many great transfers, elite quarterback coming back for his third year, so many weapons on the outside, and they just got physically beat. It didn't matter how many weapons they had on the outside. It didn't matter, how many dynamic players they got on defense. The offense didn't execute because that defensive line for Kentucky just ate them for dinner. They have to be able to show that they can hold up to that. And South Carolina is going to give you another good test because they're a very physical front as well. If you can hold up and, win this one by 14 points, make everyone feel a little bit better about where you are, they probably rocket back up into my top 10. The thing is, I got to see it to believe it. I'm very worried about this team. I do have South Carolina winning it. So it's going to be a really, really fun matchup, but it's one of those that Ole Miss's season could effectively end on Saturday. I don't like saying that because obviously the CFP isn't the end-all be-all, but if you were to ask a Ole Miss fan, they probably would share that sentiment. And then you have some couple others. I think UNLV's got to make a point this upcoming weekend, but the other thing I want to talk about, what's on the table in Tallahassee this upcoming weekend? This game has been just kneecapped in the worst possible way since the beginning of the year. I think everyone felt like going into this game, we were going to be deciding who was going to be in Charlotte. It wasn't necessarily that both these teams were going or the winner of it was outright going to win the conference, but it felt like whoever won this game was going to be in a shoe-in to possibly meet Miami in that championship game. It's weird because I still think this is a huge game for Clemson. I still think this is a chance to go on the road for the first time since that Georgia game, prove your point that you are still an elite team in this conference, and show that the past couple of weeks is a little bit more indicative of who you are in 2024 than that first week against Georgia. So I still think there's a lot on the table here. I think Cade Klubnik is one of those players that has so much momentum rolling downhill. Is definitely one of those guys that he's probably playing the second best, at least in terms of quarterbacks, the second best in the ACC right now. So he's playing really good football. He's got to be able to do it on the road against a defense that is going to be the toughest test that he's faced thus far. It's going to, or not thus far, but outside of Georgia thus far. It's going to be really, really fun to watch this one unfold, and I think it's going to be one of those games that Clemson has just about everything to lose, and the team you're playing has absolutely nothing to lose. Brock Glenn is going to get the start for Florida State in this game with DJU being out with a broken finger. It's going to be really interesting to see how this kid handles it because there's been a lot of fans that have been yelling about benching DJ, and he hasn't been put in the game until DJ got hurt. So can't necessarily be a ton of confidence that he's going into this game with, but at the end of the day, it's one of those games that can totally flip this season on its head. Florida State is not going to be good this year. I feel very confident in saying that. The thing is, you get this one big win over Clemson, you can sell that for quite some time on the recruiting trail, and that very much matters for Florida State. They need every single chip they can possibly use in the recruiting world right now, and they have zero. So getting this win on Saturday would mean the world to them. So obviously, some juice has been taken out of this matchup, no two ways about that, but the way I look at it, I still think it's huge for both teams, just in very, very different circumstances than we thought going into the season. Then you got a couple of top 10 teams that I just think are in a little bit of danger this upcoming week. Top 10 team has fallen every single week except for week 3, and that was when Missouri just barely escaped Boston College. So it's going to be a really fun week. I feel like we're going to get at least one top 10 team that goes down, and Missouri would obviously be the easy answer here. Going on the road to A&M is never going to be easy. I do have my worries about that offense. I think some of the things that I was worried about have been kind of talked out of, but just by the way that some defenses were facing them. But at the end of the day, I do think this is a really tough matchup for them going on the road for the first time in the year. I do have A&M winning it. I feel a little bit worse about that now than when I made it, but at the end of the day, I am going to roll with the Aggies here. I think it's one of those games that Missouri just might not be all the way ready for as of right now. Oh, excuse me, I got this back to back. Now we'll talk about Michigan here because they're an underdog heading into Seattle this upcoming weekend for the title rematch. They very badly need to win this game. I think it's one of those games that everyone's just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop for Michigan. They're waiting for them to put up an absolute stinker, lose one of these games that they've been able to escape with, and possibly, everyone gets to bury them a little bit more. But at the end of the day, I think they're one of those teams that's just going to be really tough to get out. I think they're going to be a really tough team to just get a beat on by any means, and especially for a team like Washington that I don't think is all that terrifying of an offense. I don't think they're going to be able to do what USC did. I don't think they're going to be able to do what Texas did, obviously. But at the end of the day, it's definitely a sketchy game. It's one of those games that Michigan's going to have to come prepared, and frankly, they got to be prepared for every single game coming forward because they don't have it nearly as explosive of an offense to feel good about games right now. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this one unfold. I think when you talk about this Michigan team right now, you can't feel great when they go on the road ever. You can't feel great really when they play anyone ever right about now. But I tend to believe they'll take care of business. I don't feel great about that by any means. And then you got a number of other ones. You got Tennessee on the road at Arkansas, going to be a really interesting matchup just to see where the Vols are after that bye week. And then Miami going on the road. We talked about Ohio State hosting Iowa, Georgia playing Auburn. There's plenty of big-time games that possibly could go the other direction, and maybe we do have one of those, probably not NIU level losses, but maybe we do have a little bit of an upset in the top 10 this upcoming weekend. And then we got a travel that is going to play a big part in this upcoming weekend. My wonder is, does Vegas kind of bake in travel a little bit more aggressively after this weekend, regardless of the results? Because I think when you're talking about Miami, Michigan, Virginia Tech, and then multiple others that are heading out west this upcoming week, we don't really know what that's like. I think there are a number of examples of, people doing this in an out-of-conference game early in the season, or doing this in week 1 with LSU going all the way out to play USC. The reality is, this is a conference game in the middle of the week. A lot of these teams played on Saturday. They flew out probably on Wednesday, Thursday, and now they got to play again. It's going to be really tough to deal with. I mean, you talk about even the practice schedule from, let's say, Miami, who had more time than most of these teams. They probably got back onto the practice field on Sunday, got 2 or 3 practices in, and then flew out to California. And now just have to figure it out on the fly. It's going to be really interesting to watch this one unfold, and I think when you talk about Miami in particular, I think that's probably the biggest team to talk about here. They're one of those teams that you just worry about throughout the whole entirety of the year. I think they're an elite team. I think they have every ability to make the playoff, win the ACC, go on to possibly compete for a national title. They're also a team that's introducing a lot of new players. They're also a team that's relying on a lot of those new players to make a big-time effect in this game. Maybe they just start a little bit slow, and maybe they make people a little bit more nervous about those games coming up with teams going out to Stanford, teams going out to Cal, going out to UCLA, USC, and Washington and Oregon over in the Big Ten. I think it's one of those things that we just haven't really been able to test. So this week is kind of like that guinea pig. It's kind of figuring out, where Miami is, where Virginia Tech is, where all of these teams are, and how big of an effect this travel thing really does have on college football. It's going to be really hard to figure out what that is as of right now, but I think it's one of those things that we'll look back at the end of the week and say, Miami barely escaped, Virginia Tech might have taken a loss, maybe Michigan took a loss, and we're looking up and saying, maybe we should bump up those points just a little bit more if they're going on the road and playing a big-time game, especially all the way out west. And then you got some teams that just have to bounce back in the biggest possible way. I think the biggest one is obviously Georgia. You had a game last week that you just didn't look like Georgia to me, especially in that first half, obviously. Didn't remotely look like what Georgia is. They didn't play elite defense on that back end, and Auburn's going to do everything in their power to expose that back end if they can. I think it's one of those things that Auburn doesn't really have another way forward, frankly. They have to be able to beat you over top. If Georgia plays the defense they played last week, Cam Coleman and friends can absolutely have a day in this one. And then you got Ole Miss. I think when you talk about a bounce back, it's got to be huge for this team. There is not an ability to go in there and eke out a 1-point win and look really ugly doing it and make people feel confident in you on Monday. You absolutely have to go into that tough environment, get a big time win, maybe win by 10, 14 points. Just prove that you are who we thought you were. Prove that you are the team that came into this year with all the talent in the world, maybe one of the most talented rosters in the country, a third-year starter, all of the weapons, a coach that felt like he was turning a corner in his career. Prove that that's still the case. Prove it's not, one of those seasons kind of like Florida State where you just show up and get really disappointed early on, and then you're looking at the rest of the schedule with a little bit of dread in your eyes. So it's going to be really interesting to watch this team this upcoming weekend, and frankly, the biggest thing that you'll learn is just the mental toughness of this team and the leadership on that team. Then we got a Louisville team that is really, really interesting this upcoming weekend. I think when you talk about this game against SMU, there's not an ability to really bounce back, but not all the way. You had a Notre Dame game last week where you made just way too many mistakes. There were a number of things where you make one less mistake, you make a couple less mistakes in that game, you probably come out on the right side, and then you have all the momentum going into this one. But you didn't. You definitely took a big-time loss, and SMU is going to come in there, and they're playing really good football right about now, especially on the offensive side of the ball. You're going to have to be ready to roll in this one. No two ways about that. And then you got some others. I think Miami, after that weird performance against Virginia Tech, want to see more from that back end of that defense for sure. Arkansas, after a huge loss, looking for a huge win against Tennessee. And then, obviously, you got Washington just trying to bounce back from that title game against Michigan. So we'll see what happens in that one. Going to be a really, really fun weekend. And I think it's going to be defined by a lot of the mental toughness, a lot of the leadership on these teams. Then we got to talk about the Heisman, and it's maybe the most fun race that we've had in quite some time. Really one of the more fun races that I've ever witnessed, at least into 5 weeks. We'll get to the end, the finish line at some point, but at the end of the day, I think when you talk about this, Ashton Jeanty is doing things that are just downright unreal. I believe his line for this upcoming weekend for his rushing yards is 199.5. That's absurd. That should never be a line for a running back for rushing yards in a game. It's absolutely insane what he's able to do up there in Boise, Idaho right now. And I don't care if he plays in the Mountain West. Watch this guy play and tell me he is not a front runner for the Heisman. He should be at the very least number 2 on your list. And if he's number 2, this is your number 1. This is the best player in college football. He's an absolute monster. One of those guys that every time he steps on the field, he does something that I don't think should be physically possible by a kid that age. He is outright incredible. I don't know if y'all saw the video of him playing basketball this week, but yeah, he's a freak. He's a freak athlete in every single sense of the word. He is not built the same as we are. He is absolutely incredible, and he's one of those players that you really don't get to see very often. So soak it all in, enjoy this one, because this guy is special, and he's not going to be around for too much longer. Then you got Jalen Milroe, and I think when you talk about this kid, there were so many worries about him last year. There were so many things that you could poke holes in and worry about. The reality is he's playing great football. He's throwing the ball really efficiently. He's running all over the field as he is, and he's pretty much what Kirby Smart described him as. He's one of the best running backs in the country that can also throw a 50-yard deep ball on the money. He's as dangerous as it gets, and he's taken a big-time stride this year. And then you have Cam Ward, one of the best shows in the entire sport down there in Miami. He's incredible. He's one of those guys that anywhere he is on the field, you feel like he can score a touchdown. He almost did when he was getting tackled. He just shuttled the ball out, and his tight end almost took it to the house. He's incredible in every sense of the word. He is so much fun to watch. Does make a couple of mistakes here and there, but at the end of the day, he's a very, very fun player. Took another step forward in his development this year, and he's going to be tons of fun to watch. And you got other guys, Quinn Ewers, Miller Moss, Nico Imaliava could have a huge week this week. Jackson Dart could bounce back. There's so many players to watch in this Heisman race, and I think when he comes down to it, those top 4 are about as good as I've ever seen them. They're so much fun to watch. It's really, really cool to have three different positions represented, obviously, and I think it's one of those that it's going to come down to the wire, and it's going to be really fun to watch it do that. But this upcoming week is just all over the place. I think when you talk about all of the different questions you have going into this one, it's even hard to come up with the questions because you don't know where it's going to hit you from. You don't know where this weekend's going to go crazy, but we'll take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to get into my best bets. We're going to get into my picks for this upcoming weekend. I think there's a lot out there. There's not a lot that I feel super confident in because of how chaotic this week could be, but we'll break down the ones that I do like right after this, so stick with us.